Hey everyone, it's your guy back again, breaking down a story that's been dominating headlines and rattling nerves across the globe. Recently, Israeli Defense Minister Katz's internal remarks got leaked to the press, and wow, they sound absolutely bloodthirsty. He's talking about how targets inside Iran are already selected. War could break out as soon as tomorrow, no withdrawal from southern Lebanon, and tactical escalations in Gaza are always on the table. A lot of people online are immediately on edge, thinking Israel is about to go nuclear, that a full-blown Middle Eastern war is just one matchstick away. But honestly, I see it from a completely different angle. In my view, all this loud, aggressive posturing actually screams one thing. Israel is deep in strategic anxiety and running on fumes. And for Iran, which has been squeezed under sanctions and shadow wars for years, this isn't a real threat. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opening to flip the board today. We're going to tear this apart step by step and lay out why I believe Israel just handed the strategic initiative right over to Tehran. Let's start by dissecting Katz's own statements, because hidden inside them are three glaring contradictions that simply don't hold up under scrutiny. The first contradiction is what I call the independent action that can't stand up without the US security blanket. On one hand, he boasts loudly that Israel can strike Iran all by itself, that it doesn't need anyone's permission, but in the very same breath, he bends over backward to emphasize that none of this will interfere with the Trump administration's policy toward Iran, and that they're carefully monitoring every twist and turn in US-Iran interactions. Now, that's a huge red flag for anyone paying attention. If you truly possess the independent military capability to solve the Iranian problem on your own, why are your eyes glued to everything Washington does? Why are you syncing your operational tempo to America's strategic rhythm? The obvious answer is that this independence is mostly a theatrical performance for the domestic audience and for regional rivals to chew on. But on the strategic level, intelligence sharing, logistical resupply, diplomatic cover. Every single pillar of that operation runs straight through the US Netanyahu's government wants to claw back more autonomy within the US-Israel alliance framework. But the hard reality is that they want the glory of being independent while still clinging to the American lifeline. That internal struggle and desperation, that's the real measure of Israel's true strength or lack thereof, and from where I sit as an American observer, this is exactly the kind of dependency that US policymakers have quietly banked on for decades. It gives Washington enormous leverage to pull the leash when things get too hot. But it also means that any Israeli independent strike is, in practical terms, an American-backed operation, whether they admit it or not. And that puts US credibility and assets directly in the crosshairs. If Iran decides to retaliate, the second contradiction is that Israel's demand for absolute security is fundamentally incompatible with its policy of permanent occupation. Katz insists that unless Hezbollah is completely and verifiably disarmed, the IDF will not retreat one single inch from southern Lebanon, and they've even coordinated with the US Central Command to maintain a joint security zone. But here's the thing. Anyon, who's actually studied Middle Eastern history, knows that completely disarming Hezbollah is a political and military pipe dream. Hezbollah isn't just a ragtag militia, it's a deeply entrenched political force within Lebanese society with a massive grassroots support network and deep religious authority. They run hospitals, schools, social services. They're woven into the fabric of the country. Israel trying to achieve that goal through indefinite military occupation, that's setting itself up for a replay of the 2006 Lebanon War, but on a larger and more painful scale. The bigger the occupation zone, the more outposts you have to defend, the longer your troops stay. The more vulnerable they become to ambushes, IEDs, and guerrilla tactics that bleed them dry one soldier at a time. This occupation as defense strategy only burns through Israel's limited national resources, both financial and human, and systematically erodes the morale and combat effectiveness of its elite units. And from an American perspective, every day that Israeli troops are bogged down in Lebanon is another day that US CENTCOM has to coordinate deconfliction, provide intelligence, and potentially rescue operations if things go south. That's not just Israel's problem. That's a drain on American military attention and taxpayer dollars, which is exactly why many in Washington are quietly furious about this endless entanglement. The third contradiction is that the so-called tactical upgrade in Gaza is actually a tacit admission of strategic stalemate. Katz threatens more localized ground operations and targeted killings against Hamas. But think about it. Doesn't that essentially concede that the earlier large-scale military campaigns completely failed to achieve their goals? Hostages are still not all recovered. Hamas military capacity hasn't been eradicated, and Israeli deterrence is nowhere near being restored. When you can't break through with conventional massive offensives, and you fall back on targeted killings and small unit raids, that's usually a desperate move when you've run out of better strategic options. Hamas tunnel network in Gaza is an underground labyrinth, deeply intertwined with civilian infrastructure, and you simply can't solve that problem with air power or commando raids alone. Every time Israel bombs a tunnel, they kill civilians, which fuels global outrage and puts more pressure on the US to rein them in. Kat's tough talk here sounds less like a strategy and more like political theater aimed at shoring up domestic support while ceasefire negotiations are stalled and pressure is mounting on his government from all sides. And as an American, I can tell you that this kind of endless cycle, escalation, retaliation, international condemnation, US veto at the UN, repeat, is exhausting for American diplomats and military planners who have to clean up the mess every single time. So once you lay out these three paradoxes, Israel's real situation becomes painfully transparent. It's lashing out in every direction, but none of those fronts are actually collapsing. Hamas in Gaza isn't wiped out. Hezbollah in Lebanon is fully intact and waiting. The Syrian front is volatile and unpredictable. The Houthis in Yemen are still attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea, which directly affects global supply chains and American consumer prices. By the way, and now Israel is threatening to strike Iran's homeland directly. For a country that's geographically tiny, with a population of just over 9 million, and an economy that relies heavily on international trade and investment. This kind of multi-front, high-intensity conflict is the textbook definition of strategic overreach. They don't have the manpower, the industrial base, or the economic cushion to sustain this for months, let alone years, and Iran. This is exactly the kind of grinding, ugly, drawn-out fight that Iran has spent decades preparing for. Prolonged warfare and asymmetric attrition are its bread and butter. They've been watching Israel bleed in Gaza and Lebanon, and they're salivating at the prospect of turning the entire region into one giant meat grinder for Israeli forces. Let me break down exactly how Iran can exploit this moment, because they have at least three major openings to walk through, and each one is a dagger aimed at Israel's weakest points. The first opening is to use Israel's own commitment to stay in southern Lebanon as a trap, turning that occupation into Iran's own attrition-killing field. Katz says no withdrawal, no matter what. Well, that's like putting your neck in a noose and handing the rope to your enemy. Iran can easily step up its supply lines through land corridors, funneling more precision-guided missiles, drones, and advanced air defense systems to Hezbollah. They can help Hezbollah rebuild defensive networks in the south and carry out regular high-precision strikes on IDF positions. Not just random rocket barrages, but targeted attacks that pick off patrols, supply convoys, and command posts. Every Israeli soldier that gets hit, every visible casualty that goes back home in a flag-draped coffin. That amplifies anti-war sentiment inside Israel and widens the political fractures in Netanyahu's coalition. Israeli society is small and tightly knit. Everyone knows someone in the military. Casualties hit differently there than they do in a country like the US at that point. His never retreat 1-inch pledge might not even survive for a month before it implodes from domestic pressure. This strategy of dragging things out, wearing the enemy down, and waiting for internal collapse is the very essence of Iran's axis of resistance philosophy. And from a US standpoint, the longer Israel stays in Lebanon, the more American weapons and intelligence are consumed in that quagmire. We're effectively subsidizing a stalemate that benefits no one except Iran. The second opening is to deepen operational coordination with Hamas in Gaza. Kat's threats about targeted killings and localized ground operations actually expose the IDF's exhaustion in a total war scenario. Iran can use this moment to ramp up intelligence sharing and tactical coordination with Hamas, even smuggling in better anti-tank missiles, portable anti-aircraft systems, and electronic warfare gear through Gaza's tunnel network. These aren't just defensive weapons, they're force multipliers that can turn a ragtag resistance into a serious threat to Israeli armor and air superiority. If Hamas can successfully pull off just a few defensive or counterattacks that really sting the IDF and produce undeniable victories, like knocking out a Merkava tank or downing an Apache helicopter, that shatters the aura of Israel's invincible targeted killing strategy. It also reignites anti-Israel sentiment across the broader Arab world, putting even more diplomatic and moral pressure on Israel while leaving it increasingly isolated regionally and globally. And for the US, That means more headaches in Arab capitals, more strain on the Abraham Accords, and more difficulty keeping our regional allies in line. Iran doesn't even have to fire a single missile itself. It just arms proxies and watches the dominoes fall. The third opening, and this is the one with the biggest strategic payoff, is to exploit the hollow bluff of Israel's so-called independent strike to drive a wedge between the US and Israel. Katz says war could break out tomorrow, but at the same time, he's careful to say they won't disrupt Trump's actions. That contradiction alone is a signal that the US and Israel are not fully aligned on strategic priorities. The Trump administration, for all its tough talk, is fundamentally driven by America first, which means domestic economic stability, job numbers. And midterm election calculations are the real priorities. They absolutely do not want to be dragged into a regional war that could send global oil prices through the roof and trigger an economic downturn right before an election. That would be political suicide. Measured counterattacks that don't trigger a full war but make the US feel the direct cost of backing Israel. If international oil prices spike due to heightened tensions, US inflation, which is already a massive headache, gets worse, debt servicing costs rise. And Washington will grow increasingly hesitant about giving Israel a blank check. At some critical moment, the US might even slam on the brakes, publicly or privately, and that humiliation would be devastating for Israel's deterrence. This strategy of using economic pain points to force political rationality is often more effective than direct military confrontation. And Iran still holds the ultimate economic wild card. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow choke point, handles a massive chunk of the world's oil shipments. Any disruption there, even just a military exercise or harassment of tankers by regional militias, can spike insurance premiums and rerouting costs, pushing crude prices significantly higher. With the US already struggling with high inflation and massive federal debt, over $34 trillion. By the way, an oil price surge is like pouring salt into an open wound. American families filling up their gas tanks would feel it immediately, and that translates into voter anger, which translates into political pressure on Washington to back off. This non-military form of economic deterrence can effectively curb Israel's appetite for military adventures and push Washington to tread much more carefully in the region. More importantly, by steadily demonstrating its control over that waterway, Iran strengthens its long-term leverage over global energy security. And that's a card it can play again and again without firing a single shot. And if we go even deeper, Iran has two more fundamental advantages for the long haul: its industrial base and its demographic scale. Israel's cutting-edge weapons systems are heavily dependent on foreign military aid, mostly from the US, which provides over $3 billion annually, and its ammunition stockpiles and spare parts supply chains are vulnerable to disruption. If a major conflict breaks out, Israel would burn through its precision-guided munitions in weeks, maybe days. And then they're begging Washington for emergency resupply, which takes time and political approval. Iran, on the other hand, has built a relatively self-sufficient defense industry over decades of sanctions, capable of mass-producing drones, ballistic missiles, rockets, and other consumable munitions. They don't need anyone's permission to keep their factories running. In a prolonged war, Iran can keep its assembly lines humming and replenish its arsenal indefinitely, while Israel's supply lines are subject to political whims, congressional debates, and logistical constraints that could leave them high and dry at a critical moment. Add to that Iran's population of nearly 90 million people and a landmass of 1,640,000 square kilometers, roughly 70 times the size of Israel, and you get a strategic resilience that Israel simply cannot match. Iran can absorb blows, retreat into its vast interior, and regenerate its forces, while Israel has nowhere to go if its borders are breached. Once a conflict drags into a long attrition phase, Israel's manpower reserves, social cohesion, and economic stability will face severe tests. Think reserve call-ups that empty offices and factories. Think tourism and investment drying up. Think a generation of young Israelis dealing with PTSD, while Iran can continue grinding forward on its own internal strength, with its leadership safely entrenched in bunkers deep underground. The more Katz yells for a quick knockout blow, the more Iran should double down on dragging the enemy into a slow, painful, unwinnable quagmire that breaks Israel's economy and its national psyche. So here's my bottom line, and I am not pulling any punches. Katz closed-door tough talk is less about showing real military muscle and more about revealing a strategic meltdown that's happening in plain sight. A truly strong and confident nation doesn't need to chant war tomorrow every time a microphone is near. A genuinely capable military doesn't need to constantly shout, "Well, never retreat 1 inch" to prove its resolve. That kind of rhetoric is what you use when you're trying to convince yourself as much as your enemies. The more Israel bellows at everyone around it, threatening Iran pounding Gaza, occupying Lebanon trading blows with Syria and Yemen, the more it exposes its own anxiety and its dwindling resources. They're fighting like a cornered animal, not like a confident superpower. This is absolutely not the time to be cowed by threats or to escalate recklessly out of pride. Instead, it's the moment to calmly see through the bully's fragile exterior and seize this strategic window with both hands, using the axis of resistance to drain Israel's will, using the Strait of Hormuz to shake American resolve, and using long-term strategic patience to shatter any illusion of a quick U.S.-Israeli victory. And let me be absolutely clear, and this is the American perspective talking, if Israel does cross the line and strike Iranian soil. Iran must respond decisively and forcefully, not with symbolic fireworks, but with real painful blows that make the price so steep that no future Israeli government would dare try it again. That means hitting military bases, economic infrastructure, or strategic assets that actually hurt. As long as Tehran holds on to this clarity, this patience, and this willingness to hit back hard when necessary, they have a genuine shot at turning Israel's strategic overreach into their own historic breakthrough. And from where I sit, the US would be wise to start preparing for that scenario. Because if Iran wins this waiting game, the entire balance of power in the Middle East shifts, and American influence in the region takes a permanent hit. At the end of the day, this whole Middle Eastern chess match, does it come down to who yells the loudest? Does it come down to who has the most missiles? Absolutely not. It comes down to who has the deeper strategic depth, who has stronger internal unity, and who can endure the longest, ugliest grind. Israel's depth and endurance are not nearly as solid as its rhetoric would have you believe. Iran's resilience and potential run far deeper than most people in Washington or Tel Aviv want to admit. The next phase of this confrontation, it's all about who can better manage the most unforgiving variable of all time. And right now, the clock is ticking in Tehran's favor. That's a wrap for this episode. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay sharp, stay informed, and don't believe the hype. This is your guy, signing off.